we do need to continue to work to ensure that there are proper controls on the sale and the transfer of this technology, and I look forward to doing that with my colleagues. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves.
Oh, they're not.
Does any member claim time in opposition? Seeing none, the gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to yield a minute to the distinguished gentleman from California, the chairman of the committee.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. This amendment expresses a sense of Congress that conveys our firm opposition to any use of facial recognition technology to suppress criticism or dissent, as well as our opposition to the U.S. government's sale or transfer of facial recognition technology to countries using this technology to suppress human rights. Critically, the amendment also acknowledges the IC's unique responsibility to develop robust policies and procedures that prevent the abuse of this technology. To ensure that the intelligence community is held accountable, the amendment requires the submission of a comprehensive report analyzing any use of facial recognition technology by the IC and the associated implications for privacy and civil liberties, especially among marginalized communities. Ms. J. Paul's amendment requires the intelligence community to establish clear policies and procedures, enhance transparency, and increase oversight concerning the applications of these new capabilities. Her amendment lays the groundwork for a thoughtful U.S. response to the emergence of divisive and disruptive technologies and how they would fit into existing civil liberties frameworks. Again, I want to thank my colleague for her work. I'm pleased to support Ms. J. Paul's amendment, and I yield back.
Chair, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Chicago, Mr. Garcia.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of the amendment we filed to study and limit the use of facial recognition technology. The intelligence community collects large amounts of data with limited oversight about how and from whom data is collected. Facial recognition technology has shown to be less accurate on non-white faces, and its use disproportionately hurts communities of color because of algorithmic bias. This amendment studies the potential for bias and expresses the sense that people should not be targeted for their ethnicity, race, or sexual orientation, or to suppress dissent. Given the U.S. government's history of tracking protesters and activists, especially in minority communities, this is important. Congress can and should exercise federal oversight of emerging surveillance technologies for facial recognition technology. This means our work is only just beginning. I urge support for this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Washington. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment 14, printed in Part 2 of the House Report 11 to 154. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida rise?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 14, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-154, offered by Mrs. Murphy of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 491, the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Murphy, and a member opposed to each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My amendment, which I'm co-leading with Congresswoman Yvette Clarke of New York, involves a looming threat to American security and American democracy from the use of deep-fake technology by our nation's adversaries. As policymakers, we must understand this challenge and put in place a whole-of-government strategy to address it in a way that protects our interests and is consistent with our values. The U.S. intelligence community has an important role to play in this effort. The House Intelligence Committee, led by Chairman Schiff, recently held an illuminating and alarming hearing on deepfakes. As the witnesses at that hearing testified, technology now enables anyone with a computer, internet access, and technical skills to create fabricated and relatively convincing video and audio recordings that depict individuals doing or saying things that they did not do or say. The technology behind deepfakes is rapidly evolving. Soon, individuals will be able to create highly realistic and difficult to debunk video and audio content. At a time when Americans are already being inundated, especially online, by a flood of false or misleading information, deepfake technology has the potential to make it even harder for the American public to trust what it sees and hears. It's easy to imagine the different ways in which deepfake technology could be exploited by America's foes. Imagine a Russian intelligence service creating a video purporting to show an American presidential candidate accepting a bribe, or an audio recording purporting to reveal an American Secretary of State saying something inflammatory about an ally. Or imagine a Chinese-produced video that falsely depicts the commander of a U.S. military unit committing a war crime. Such efforts, if not quickly exposed as false by the United States, could create havoc. In today's world, perhaps the biggest national security threat we face is not the risk of direct military conflict between the United States and Russia, China, Iran, and another adversary. Instead, the threat lurks in the gray space, short of kinetic action. It is illustrated by Russian efforts to intervene in the 2016 presidential election, most notably in my home state of Florida. It is the threat from authoritarian governments using new technologies to spread disinformation, sow discord, create divisions, and cause the American people to lose faith in our democratic form of government. To address this threat, our amendment requires the DNI to prepare a report for Congress on how foreign countries are using or could use deepfake technology to harm the United States, and to explain how the intelligence community is working to develop appropriate countermeasures. This report will help us to understand the problem and to combat it more effectively. We must get this right, because the stakes couldn't be higher. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. Does any member claim time in opposition? Seeing none, the gentlewoman will proceed as recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Chairman Schiff.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
I thank the gentlewoman for yielding. I rise in strong support of this amendment offered by my colleagues from Florida and New York, who have both been leaders in this body focused on national security challenges posed by deepfake technologies. We in the Intel Committee held a hearing on this very topic last month, and the rate at which these capabilities are evolving is almost as breathtaking as what they can produce. High-quality video and other types of media that convincingly portray individuals saying or doing things that never happened. The potential for a foreign adversary to undermine an election, foment chaos, or create a national security crisis with a sophisticated digital forgery means that we need to ensure the intelligence community is fully considering the wide-ranging implications of deepfakes, including the capacity of foreign entities and adversaries to weaponize machine-generated media. This report will also give us a detailed picture about how the intelligence community is coordinating efforts, activities, and research surrounding this emerging technology, and if there are lingering gaps in resources or assignments of responsibility, since we need to be clear-eyed about how disruptive and devastating a well-timed deepfake could be during an election or a tense diplomatic standoff. I want to thank my colleague for her work on this amendment, and I'm very proud to support it.
The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I urge support for this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment number 15, printed in Part B of the House Report 116 to 154. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Printed in Part B of House Report number 116-154, offered by Mrs. Murphy of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 491, the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Murphy, and member opposed to each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our amendment would require the Director of National Intelligence, in coordination with the Secretaries of State and Defense, to prepare a report for Congress on efforts by Iran to establish long-term influence in Syria using both hard and soft power, and the threat that this poses to U.S. interests and allies, including Israel. Syria's civil war, which began in 2011, has brought an influx of Iranian-backed forces into Syria. Iran and Syria are both designated by the United States as state sponsors of terrorism. Their military partnership dates back decades, and Iran regards Syria as one of its most important allies. Iran and Iranian-backed forces, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Hezbollah, have provided manpower, training, weapons, and funding to the Syrian government led by the President Bashar al-Assad. This assistance, coupled with support from Russia, have enabled the Assad government to retain or regain territory in Syria, and the Assad government currently maintains control over roughly 2/3 of the country. Iran's goals in Syria include protecting the Assad government, increasing Iran's regional influence, threatening Israel from a closer location, building weapon production facilities and other military infrastructure, and securing a land bridge that would connect Iran to Hezbollah's stronghold in southern Lebanon via Iraq and Syria. It is clear that Iran is seeking long-term influence in Syria and is pursuing this objective through military, political, and social means. Iran's efforts to establish a military presence in Syria has led to repeated confrontations with Israel. In February of 2018, Israel shot down an Iranian drone flying over Israeli territory and then targeted the base in Syria from which the drone was launched. In May 2018, Israel launched strikes against Iranian military installations in Syria. Iran responded by firing missiles at Israeli positions in the Golan Heights, and Israel then targeted nearly all of Iran's military infrastructure in Syria. Iranian and Iranian-backed forces also seek to enhance their influence in Syria through non-military means, such as purchasing strategic real estate, constructing Shia religious centers and schools, securing loyalty from Sunni tribes, and inducing the Assad government to open Farsi language departments at Syrian universities. In a startling move, President Trump has proposed to withdraw all or most U.S. forces from Syria, a proposal I view as a profound mistake. But regardless of the number of U.S. troops deployed to Syria, I believe it is a vital U.S. interest to prevent Iran, Hezbollah, and other Iranian-backed forces from establishing an enduring presence in Syria. Our amendment would require the DNI to assess how Iran is using hard and soft power to gain long-term influence in Syria. Among other things, the IC would examine how U.S. efforts to strengthen Kurdish forces in Syria could undermine Iran, how the U.S. helps Israel identify threats from Iran in Syria, and how Iran's influence over Syrian institutions could increase the likelihood that the Islamic State will reconstitute itself inside Syria. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. Does any member seek recognition to speak in opposition? Gentleman from Illinois.
I rise to oppose the amendment. I seek the time to speak.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I rise in support of the Murphy-Schneider amendment that makes abundantly clear it is of the utmost importance to prevent Iran from establishing any enduring presence in Syria. The amendment also requires the Director of National Intelligence to report on Iran's efforts to establish a foothold in Syria and on the threat this poses to the United States and our allies, in particular Israel. Madam Speaker, I stood before this body, this Congress, in the last Congress, urging support for my amendment to require a report on Iran's support for proxy forces in Syria and Lebanon, and I am pleased that this report remains in this bill. Today, we are building on this important effort with the Murphy-Schneider Amendment. I thank my good friend from Florida, Stephanie Murphy, for her leadership on this issue. Iran is a bad actor that has spread its malign influence and continued to engage in destabilizing activities throughout the Middle East region as well as beyond. The Iranian regime has and continues to establish deep ties within Syria through military, political, economic, social, and cultural means. This is a dangerous behavior that must be checked. Iran must not be allowed to maintain a permanent foothold in Syria that threatens our allies and stability in the region. To stand up to Iran, we must first understand the full extent of Iran's activities in Syria, and that is what this amendment does. I look forward to seeing this report and engaging on how we can prevent Iran from maintaining a permanent presence in Syria. I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting this important amendment, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I urge support for the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment 16, printed in Part B of House Report 116 to 154. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 16, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-154, offered by Mr. Brindisi of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 491, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Brindisi, and member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Madam Speaker, I rise today urging adoption of my amendment, which makes clear that nothing in the underlying bill contradicts existing federal law regarding acts of international terrorism, providing support to terrorists, or aiding terrorists. The underlying bill helps keep our country safe by ensuring the intelligence community has the resources and authorities it needs to do its job. It also makes sure the intelligence community can improve and adapt to today's rapidly changing threats and technologies by improving the collection and analytic capabilities against our adversaries like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. My amendment makes it crystal clear that our country will remain tough on international terrorism. Terrorism continues to be a serious threat to our national security. This provision strengthens the underlying bill by ensuring current law regarding terrorism is not changed, so terrorists and those who support them can be brought to justice. Again, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Thank you, Madam Chair. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Is there any member who seeks to speak in opposition? Seeing none, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I again urge adoption of the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment number 17, printed in Part B of House Report 116 to 154. What purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 17, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-154, offered by Mr. Kinzinger of Illinois.
Pursuant to House Resolution 491, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. My amendment is very simple. It would require that the Director of National Intelligence and other relevant agencies to report to Congress on the threat that international mobile subscriber identity catchers, also referred to as cell site simulators, or under the brand name Stingrays, pose to the U.S. government, personnel, and national security. In addition to providing this report, the DNI would need to provide recommendations to Congress regarding possible policy changes to counter these devices. IMSI catchers send signals to mobile phones that appear to be coming from legitimate mobile networks. Once connected, the phones are used to track the locations of the user, which can be seen by whomever is controlling the IMSI catcher. The more advanced versions of these cell devices allow their owners to even access messages and phone call data. Many of us were shocked when a report came out last year that the Department of Homeland Security had found these devices around the national capital region. Even more concerning was that many of these were located around sensitive government buildings. My amendment would help Congress understand the proliferation of these devices around our nation, with a focus on their prevalence in the national capital region. We need to know which actors, foreign or domestic, are deploying them and what Congress can do to ensure the safekeeping of our national security apparatus. I urge support for this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Is there any member who seeks to speak in opposition? Seeing none, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I ask for support for this, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 18, printed in part of House Report 116 to 154. What purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 18, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-154, offered by Ms. Hill of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 491, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Hill, and member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume. I rise in support of an amendment to H.R. 3494. I believe strongly in the principle of government transparency. It's something I ran on and I talk about, and that I've spent my time in Congress working to deliver on accountability and transparency as the Vice Chair of the Oversight Committee and through other legislation. Today, I'm introducing this amendment to clarify what Congress already believes to be the law, that federal whistleblowers have the ability to make protected disclosures to the appropriate congressional committee of jurisdiction, not just members of the Intelligence Committee. At a time like this, we cannot afford ambiguity, and this technical change will allow congressional committees to conduct their business in a more timely and effective manner. This amendment is not my first effort to protect whistleblowers, nor will it be my last. Those with the courage to stand up and say something is not right should have every single protection that we, as Congress, can offer to them. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. Does any member claim time in opposition? Seeing none, the gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I urge all of my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back. Thank you so much.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 19, printed in Part P of House Report 116 to 154. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 19, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-154, offered by Mr. Levin of Michigan.
Pursuant to House Resolution 491, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. According to the Anti-Defamation League, domestic extremists killed at least 50 people in the United States in 2018, a sharp increase from the 37 extremist-related murders documented in 2017. Indeed, that's a 26% jump in 1 year. Given the disturbing rise in plots and incidents of domestic terrorism nationwide, I'm pleased with the provision of this bill requiring that a joint report on domestic terrorism be submitted to Congress each year by the DNI, FBI Director, and the Undersecretary of Homeland Security for Intelligence and Analysis. My amendment requires that this comprehensive report on domestic terrorism be made available on the public websites, not just of the National Counterterrorism Center, but also of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Homeland Security. The amendment also specifies that the report should be made publicly available no later than 30 days after submission to the appropriate congressional committees. We can't let something this important be delayed over and over again. We need to ensure that this report is accessible not just to promote transparency, but also to help policymakers nationwide recognize the scope and of the threat that domestic terrorism poses, and to encourage academic research necessary to better understand the scourge of domestic terrorism so that we might bring it to an end once and for all. And I'm talking about policymakers on the local and the state level as well as the federal level. I want to thank Chairman Schiff in particular and your staff for your leadership on this bill and for working with me on this and other provisions. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Does any member claim time in opposition? Seeing none, the gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 20, printed in Part B of House Report 116 to 154. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I rise to offer an amendment on behalf of Representative Malinowski.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 20, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-154, offered by Mr. Schiff of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 491, the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
I thank the chair. I rise to support this amendment, which adds an additional requirement to Section 502, a report on the repression of ethnic Muslim minorities in the Xinjiang region of the People's Republic of China. The human rights crisis underway in Xinjiang is staggering in scale. Open source analysis based on extensive reviews of satellite imagery and Chinese government documents has concluded that as many as 1.5 million Muslims could be held in internment camps by the Chinese government. Despite this body of evidence, the executive branch has rebuffed attempts to clearly describe the scope and scale of this crisis. H.R. 3494 calls for a comprehensive U.S. government assessment that addresses the number of persons detained, a description of forced labor practices in the camps, and an assessment of the surveillance, detection, and control methods associated with China's new high-tech policing model. Mr. Malinowski's amendment adds an additional requirement for the intelligence community to assess and identify the technological and financial support provided by U.S.-based companies to the Chinese government's repressive operations in Xinjiang. In light of the alarming public reports detailing cooperation between prominent U.S. companies and foreign companies aiding and abetting the Chinese Communist Party's surveillance state, this amendment could not be timelier. I want to thank my colleagues, particularly Mr. Malinowski, for his tireless work to support human rights. I'm happy to support the amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Does any member claim time in opposition? Seeing none, the gentleman from California is recognized.
I urge support for the amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It's now in order to consider amendment number 21, printed in Part B of the House Report 116 to 154. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I rise to offer this amendment on behalf of Representative Presley of Massachusetts.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 21, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-154, offered by Mr. Schiff of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 491, the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Madam Chair, this amendment clarifies Section 602 of the bill dealing with domestic terrorism. Section 602 would require the FBI, DHS, and National Counterterrorism Center to produce an annual report and strategic intelligence assessment on domestic terrorism. Ms. Presley's amendment would require more information regarding any training or resources on domestic terrorism provided by the FBI, DHS, and National Counterterrorism Center to assist federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies. This would enhance oversight and transparency in the area and give us a better sense of how domestic terrorism training has been provided to law enforcement throughout the United States. Again, I thank my colleague for her work, and I urge our colleagues to support the amendment and the underlying bill and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Does any member claim time in opposition? Seeing none, the gentleman from California is recognized.
I urge support for the amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 22, printed in Part B of House Report 116 to 154. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Madam Chairwoman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 22, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-154, offered by Mr. Rose of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 491, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Rose, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I yield myself such time as I may consume. I rise in support of my amendment to H.R. 3494. Our law enforcement officers stand on the front lines of defending the American people from domestic and international terrorist threats. It's our job as Congress to make sure that they have the most up-to-date information about the evolving threats posed by terrorism, including the use of advanced conventional weapons. One such evolving threat is the danger posed by terrorist use of conventional and advanced conventional weapons, including unregistered weapons that lack serial numbers. To address this issue, my amendment to the Intelligence Authorization Act will require the Department of Homeland Security to conduct an annual assessment of the domestic and international terrorist threats posed by conventional weapons, as well as advanced conventional weapons. This is a simple, straightforward amendment that seeks to put important information about terrorist threats in the hands of our law enforcement officers. I encourage all my colleagues to support this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Is there any member claiming time in opposition? The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I What's the next page? Excuse me. This one, okay. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Law enforcement needs to have the information they need to understand these threats. The assessment of the terrorist threat posed by conventional weapons and advanced conventional weapons that I call for in this amendment will do just that. Additionally, this amendment will then, this assessment will then be shared with Congress and with law enforcement so that our frontline officers have the information they need to understand these evolving threats. I urge all my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 23 printed in Part B of House Report 116 to 154. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Madam Chairwoman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 23 printed in Part B of House Report number 116-154 offered by Mr. Rose of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 491, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Rose, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I yield myself such time as I may consume. I rise to offer an amendment to Title VI of H.R. 3494 entitled Reports and Other Matters. As a combat veteran, I can tell you firsthand that intelligence drives operations, and it's imperative to the security of our homeland that the U.S. maintains its superiority when it comes to intelligence. However, a growing concern I have is when our former or retired intelligence professionals choose to later work for a foreign government. We saw it with former NSA employees working as hackers for the United Arab Emirates Project Raven. Interviews and documents showed that the NSA's surveillance techniques were central to the country's monitoring efforts. Reporting showed that American ex-intelligence personnel would target the UAE government's opponents online. This information, provided to them by the country's NSA equivalent, didn't just target terrorists, but also human rights activists and journalists, those whom the UAE deemed unfavorable. It's concerning when our best and brightest go off to conduct or advise on intelligence operations for foreign governments that in some cases are against the very people our American ideals protect. We need to understand the nature and impact of this expertise in the hands of a foreign government. What are the homeland security implications of this? My amendment will do just that. It requires the Director of National Intelligence, in coordination with other intel community partners, to conduct an annual assessment of the homeland security vulnerabilities associated with former intelligence community employees providing intelligence assistance to a foreign government. I strongly urge all my colleagues to vote in favor of this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Is there any member claiming time in opposition? Seeing none, the gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. The invaluable training, tradecraft, and expertise developed by former or retired intelligence professionals to keep our country safe, to keep Americans safe, now in the hands of a foreign government for their benefit is absolutely chilling. My amendment will tackle these concerns head-on with an annual assessment of any homeland security vulnerabilities that may be associated with this capability, cultivated from years of service to our country, now being provided to foreign governments. I urge all my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 24 printed in Part B of House Report 116 to 154 For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 24, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-154, offered by Mr. Pence of Indiana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 491, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Pence, and a member opposed to each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of my amendment, which is deeply personal. Madam Chair, I was assigned to the 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines. In 1983, my battalion was ordered to Beirut, Lebanon. On October 23rd of that same year, an Iranian national affiliated with Hezbollah, a terror group founded, trained, and financially supported by the Iranian regime, drove a truck bomb into the U.S. barracks in Beirut, killing 241 servicemen, 220 which were my fellow Marines. It is by the grace of God that I am standing here today. My battalion shipped out 10 days before the bombing. I was lucky. I was able to come home to my wife, who is expecting our first child, and my family in Columbus, Indiana. As a proud U.S. Marine, Congressman Gallego and I authorized this bipartisan, bicameral legislation to provide a sliver of justice for the 241 heroes who were not as lucky that day. Madam Chair, our amendment is simple. The URA Act would allow the families of the bombing victims to execute on the $1.6 billion in Iranian funds currently held by a European-based firm. These funds were laundered through New York before making their way to Europe, where they sit just outside the hand of justice. Regardless of the party you conference with or the district you represent, we can all agree that terrorists and those who support them financially must be held accountable for their actions. When I joined the Marines in 1979, I made a promise of Semper Fidelis. Semper Fi is a lifelong commitment held by every Marine in the Corps in America, a promise reciprocated by the Corps to all Marines. Madam Chair, we must uphold this promise. Marines are the first to fight, and this time we're fighting for the Gold Star families who lost their loved ones. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and stand with Congressman Gallego and me and our colleagues in the Senate to honor the faith and loyalty of the 241 American servicemen who made the ultimate sacrifice. Madam Chair, URA stands for our obligation to recognize American heroes, or as the Marines say, ARA. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Does any member seek time in opposition?
Thank you,
For
Madam.
what purpose does the gentleman rise?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise to claim time in opposition, though I am not opposed to the amendment.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I rise in proud support of the amendment sponsored by fellow Marine and public servant Mr. Pence. October 23rd, 1983 remains seared in the memory of all Marines. On that day, over 300 innocent people were killed in a surprise terrorist attack sponsored by the government of Iran. Most of the people killed 36 years ago were my brothers. They were U.S. Marines. They were serving our country and doing their best to preserve the peace in war-torn Lebanon. We know what the wheels of justice turn slowly. Mr. Chairman, it took over 35 years for victims to get traction in U.S. courts. But now that they are getting that traction and winning judgments, Marines in Congress are here to help to ensure that Iranian funds cannot be hidden from them in secret foreign bank accounts. This amendment helps the families of those killed and wounded by making sure that Iran is held liable for this attack. It makes it harder for Iran to hide money in overseas bank accounts when it should be paying for the pain and suffering of its victims. It shows that even 36 years after the attack, we have not forgotten, and once again proves that U.S. Marines remain no better friend and no worse enemy. Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
I thank the chairman and ranking member for their leadership and my colleague and fellow Marine from Arizona, Mr. Gallego, for his faithful service and unwavering support on this legislature. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields the question on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Indiana. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 25, printed in Part B of House Report 116 to 154. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I rise to offer, on behalf of Representative Slotkin, one of two amendments.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 25, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-154, offered by Mr. Schiff of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 491, the gentleman from California, Schiff, a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Madam Chair, the Intelligence Committee has invested considerable time and focus the last 3 years to study the painful lessons of foreign interference in our democratic system. Ms. Slotkin's amendment will enhance the work of the committee by compelling the Director of National Intelligence to identify barriers that prevent the intelligence community from fully understanding the scope and impact of these threats. Our adversaries are committed to employing a whole-of-government approach to execute their plan to disrupt our democratic system. In order to defeat these efforts, we must understand the scope of the threat. We must enlist our intelligence community to identify the scope of and the means by which our adversaries are attempting to achieve their goal. This amendment sets forth a framework by which the DNI will report to Congress on these threats and identify whether there are gaps in the IC's authorities that hinder its ability to find, assess, and enable action on foreign influence campaigns. I believe this is an important amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to support it, as well as the underlying bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Is there any member claiming time in opposition? Seeing none, the gentleman from California is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield back and urge my colleagues to support the bill.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 26, printed in Part B of House Report 116 to 154. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I rise to offer the second of Ms. Slotkin's amendments on her behalf.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 26, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-154, offered by Mr. Schiff of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 491, the gentleman from California, Schiff, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Madam Chair, we're all too familiar with the influence operations perpetrated by the Russian government during the 2016 U.S. election. As the IC articulated in its January 2017 Intelligence Community Assessment, those operations were merely the most recent in a long history of efforts to undermine the liberal democratic order. We must remain vigilant and fully informed about the operations executed by the government of Russia to influence and undermine our democratic system. To that end, this amendment requires an annual report from the Director of National Intelligence containing information about the influence operations and campaigns in the U.S. by the Russian Federation. I support the amendment and urge my colleagues to do the same.
The gentleman reserves. Does any member claim time in opposition? Seeing none, the gentleman from California is recognized.